because we are going to use the PowerPoint and then online material, we like to ask you to shut down your camera so it will run easily, hopefully. So let's start. So on March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. As of February 28 of this year, there had been over 113 million confirmed cases of coronavirus worldwide, resulting in nearly 2.5 million deaths over 223 countries. In the wake of the pandemic, social interactions and community life around the world have been altered in ways that are unprecedented in recent history. Border crossings have been closed or severely restricted by travel bans. Schools have been closed, and those with the means are working from home, making an extensive use of networking tools. As we know, restaurants, shops, museums, cultural, sporting events, and spaces for civic engagement have been shuttered across the globe. Many regions have witnessed unprecedented severe lockdowns, which have also affected the mental health of many citizens. The so-called new normality is defining our lifestyles today, while hoping that the newly developed vaccines will return us to the old normality, if ever possible or actually desired. One of the most dramatic effects of the pandemic has been the unprecedented high rates of deaths. Not only we are shocked by the large number of victims in a short time, but also its demography. People of all ages, but mostly adults and older people, have died as a consequence of the virus in hospitals in numbers sometimes that have collapsed healthcare systems and funeral services. The pandemic has also increased society inequality. It has affected mostly those in lower economic strata, citizens whose work activity requires precisely higher risk of exposure, such in hospitals, food stores, or other basic services. It has affected those also with previous poor health conditions, short access to public health care, and the higher risk of being economically affected by the burdens of quarantine and government-imposed shutdowns. Next to this dramatic situation, there is another disturbing factor to add. Most of the victims have unexpectedly died alone in intensive care units without the possibility of being accompanied by the family due to the risk of contagious. In this context of cultural trauma, memorial events, either sporadic or organized, have spread globally to all the communities affected. People not only have buried their relatives in private ceremonies, but also have organized social tributes to them, aiming both to honor the victims of the pandemic and to create a warning to others on the effects of COVID-19. To the survivors, these public memorials performed by the community they belong help also to come to terms with suddenly losses and to overcome the pain suffered. They feel recognized and supported. In fact, what it seems already vital is to remember not just the victims of the COVID-19, but also the circumstances of their deaths. Memory refers to the ways in which people construct a sense of meaning to the past and how they relate that past in relation to their present and how this builds a future together. Memories are built of personal and collective life experience, but memories may also be part of a collective body of sharing a cultural knowledge base through transmission by others. In both cases, the sharing of an experience involves the existence and putting in motion of a cultural interpretive framework and developing meaningful language that enable us to conceptualize, think, and express such experience. This constitutes a social or collective process of understanding memories and helps to situate the individual as a member of a group, being this group either a family, a sociocultural community, or a nation. In case of painful memories, the challenge in terms of society is to find a way to express this memory so it can help to structure this process of going forward together. Personal and collective memories are used in the present both to be remembered and or to be forgotten. In both cases, memories, and sometimes their denial, operates as social narratives to build the present and construct the future together. This perspective involves understanding memories as collective processes anchored in experience and in material and symbolic cultural markers. How community define both their relation to the events in the past is also closely linked to their belief system. Life and death, right and wrong, private and public. This relation and the narratives constructed around these events determine both the forces of memorialization processes. For example, how important is to remember for reconciliation process or for creating a never again mentality? What aspects of the past events are recalled and which are actively forgotten? And the nature of memorialization process itself. For example, spontaneous memorials, remembering days, memorial places, monuments, museums, etc. In fact, the challenge for most societies is how to ensure that the younger generations who did not live through the events being commemorated incorporate or transform their significance into operative learning tools for their present and future. Another element important in the equation of remembering is time or scale. Wherever it is true that the passage of time enables victims and survivors to acquire a perspective on traumatic memories and what they want to remember about them, time lengths affect also the balance between equity and healing. How much time must pass to achieve perspective? And does time actually work against mourning processes, especially when remembrance is related to contentious past? Time and stakeholders participating in process of memorialization of traumatic events create another equation. The existence of several stages of memory and consequently several layers or types of cultural representations or memorialization processes responding to different stakeholders' interests, perceptions, and necessities. James Young, in 2016, was the first to describe the existence of several stages of trauma when narrating the aftermath of 11 September 2001, and how these stages define the actions taken to define a memorial in New York. These stages respond both to different moments of the trauma process and to the different stakeholders participating or in need to participate, and are the key to define and design the different types of memorials or commemoration monuments produced, and their social purpose of message. It is in this context that memorialization process of traumatic events in relation to COVID-19 are occurring. Here, the memorialization of COVID-19 is a process that satisfies the desire to honor those who have suffered or died due to the pandemic, sometimes in a way that crystallizes in a sense of victimization or due to the circumstances of their death, and aims to promote social recovery. Most of the initiatives contains a sense of learning from the circumstances of what has meant to be exposed to the virus, an issue that turns to be highly political in front of those voices still denying the existence of a pandemic. Furthermore, and following James Young's works, memorialization initiates of COVID-19 are taking different forms depending on who initiates them, the stages of the mourning process, and to whom this message behind the memorial is addressed. This process also determines the shape of the memorial project and the stakeholders involved. Current temporary and sequential regional and local lockdowns are also configuring the shape of the Memorial Act and its materiality. Eddie and me were granted by NIKU with a pilot project called Mapping Memorialization of Pandemic Experience. We aim to map out these monuments and their relevance within the local context. We have created a database of locations around the world in order to establish themes of memorialization that are used to symbolize the emotional and political experience behind COVID-19 tributes. This 3-month pilot project is the seed for prospecting further research lines in relation of larger project proposals, one on the heritage of processes of contemporary cultural trauma, and the other one on promoting public health through heritage. Today, here we will present these results. Methodologically, we have created database information aligned with geographical location using Google Earth, which allow us to add images, videos, and online sources. The map is thus a geographical located database. Between October and December 2020, we located circa 60 sites. Obviously, it's not a complete list, but we think it is a representative picture of what had happened in 2020. We had tried to record as much possible cultural diversity and therefore have used extensive language variations of the keywords in online search tools. However, we are well aware that the results do not include all human cultural expressions of mourning and recovering from pandemic trauma processes. In this sense, we also acknowledge that our research has looked for tangible and intangible forms of overcoming trauma, guided mostly by a Western understanding of what is memorialization, very influenced by the idea of monumentalization. And therefore, these vias might have missed alternatives or different other cultural expressions of dealing with cultural trauma and death. We have categorized all the experience documented in 4 types: memorial places, ceremonies and events, cemeteries, specifically new uses or reuses of burial places, and cyber memorials. In these categories, we have collected sporadic individual manifestations, civic or grassroots initiatives, and institutionalized driving events. Some of them are private ceremonies responding of the current situation. Others are part of established religious practice, and others aim to challenge the political circumstances surrounding COVID-19 disease. As I say, here we will present some of these categories, 2 of each other, and we are going to use the Google map. Let me switch to one to the other. So here we are. That's the material that we have constructed. Let's start in Vienna. Let's start with the plaque column, which is a prominent monument in the heart of Vienna, Austria. It symbolized past resilience times in times of disease, something that resonates in the current pandemic. It was erected following a devastating plague outbreak in 1679, which affected 60,000 people, about half of the city inhabitants at that time. While the 14th century Black Death pandemic was the most fatal of the plague outbreaks, the disease would recur over and over the following centuries in Europe due to the lack of minimal hygiene measures, the lack of public drains, and recurring infestations of rats. Next, available treatments were limited, if not useless, and more important, it was unknown how the disease was transmitted and how it did infect humans. In reviews of infection disease, medical historical scholars Boris and Helga Belimorigi illustrate the situation in Vienna at that time, an account that certainly resembles somehow today's experience. Pains and suffering were heightened when each went out of the path of his friend. Even blood relatives could not visit or help one another in their need. Often the 7 gates of the city were not enough to carry out the sick and the dead. When the plague finally ended, the city felt as it had been divinely safe, and therefore a monument would rise to give thanks for those who survived. Commissioned by the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I, the plaque column was complete in 1693 in a Baroque confection. It portrays metaphorical ascents of the battle and victory of the plague, followed by royal benefactor in prayer and accompanied by saints. On the top, angels and the Holy Trinity. It was a tribute to those who miraculously saved the city from the infection, and therefore it was customary to bend the knee when passing it. Iconographically, the black column follows a look of a long tradition of votive columns that dates back to Roman antiquity, when emperators were erected at the top of the columns. Christianity changed the emperor with the Virgin Mary and became an extant practice in most Europe from the 10th century. With the arrival of the plaques, these columns were also used to invocate protection. Along these Marian columns, wooden columns were also constructed during the times of pestilence and used by those who whipped their bodies as a devotional punishment as an attempt to drive away the plague. The column in Vienna is the highest example of the monumentalization of Marian columns in the 17th century, and it represents a practice that extends to almost all towns of the Habsburg Empire for the last half of the 17th century until the end of the empire. These columns acted both as a gesture of public faith and as a marker of imperial hegemony. With the crumble of the Habsburg Empire, some of these columns were removed in countries looking for independence from the empire due to their political symbology. Later, those in Austria were instead rescued and relocated in historical centers of 20th century post-war cities as a reminders of past monuments of death and disease, but especially as a part of the reconstruction of historical national narratives through cultural heritage landmarks. Amid today's pandemic, citizens of Vienna have reappropriated the columns to memorialize those who have died due to or are sick with COVID-19. People have come to leave candles, messages, and children drawings beneath the column. As happened in the past, they are using the column both for asking for protection and to memorialize those who have died due to the infection. The significance layer of being a power of symbol of the Habsburg Empire is probably not recalled by them nowadays, but it's highly endured by the fact that the monument is still standing and was never removed. And then I would like to show you a video, short video.
In Austria, a 17th century monument depicted a play.
Hi, Laia, we can't quite hear the audio.
Oh, Okay, then I need to, sorry. I cannot, sorry. I don't know how to solve that. Okay, sorry. Then I will continue with the...
We can't see the Google Earth now either.
Yeah, I'm going to share it now.
Yeah.
Thanks. We are moving now to Brazil. The Infinity Memorial in Rio de Janeiro, which illustrates the opposite. A monument constructed ex professo to memorialize the victims of COVID-19 pandemics. The memorial is a 39-meter-long ribbon of undulating steel erected to pay tribute to those who died from coronavirus and provide families with a symbol of their loss, and in one of the worst affected cities in Brazil. It is the first type in Brazil. The memorial was designed by a Brazilian architect, Chris Santos, who had the idea of building the work as a peak of the pandemics after visiting several cemeteries in the country. It has few names now of the disease and engraved in the monument. And there is room for 4,000 more. Here you see the names in a way. Those next to there is official monuments and private initiatives of that, and anonymous constructions as well. But also some critical voices again, arguing that we need now to more expending money on healthcare systems and not in cultural heritage of art to build monuments. So what we have now is also turned into memorials, which are more, it could be also official and private. So we will go to Li Wenlang Memorial, now in China. We travel to China. Li Wenlang was China's ophthalmologist who raised awareness of early COVID-19 infection in Wuhan, China. In the December 2019, Wuhan Central Healthcare issued emergency warnings to local hospitals about a number of mysterious pneumonia cases discovered in the city in previous week. On the same day, Dr. Li, who worked at the Wuhan Central Hospital, received an internal diagnostic report of a suspect severe acute respiratory syndrome, which at that time it was they think it was SARS. On the same day, Li, who worked received an internal, the outbreak was later confirmed not to be SARS, but a new coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. He was at that moment accused by the Chinese authorities of making false comments, spreading rumors, and severely disturbing the social order. In this environment of denials, Dr. Li returned to work and later contracted COVID-19 and died in February 2020. Until today, there has been no large official memories to Dr. Li, who sounded the alarm and was reprimanded. Li's death is a still sensitive topic in China, and his family has refrained from giving media interviews. However, residents visiting the Wuhan Central Hospital offer flowers at the hospital door in his memory prior to the anniversary of his death. This spontaneous and almost hidden tribute to Dr. Li did also spread rapidly across China's digital communication platforms. And in some cases, this designed purpose to purposely criticize the government's handling of the outbreak. Today, the epidemic is largely controlled within China borders, and the official narrative has shifted to one of triumph, including a film, Days and Nights in Wuhan, and apparently that's something that we are looking for to see. There is also the Chinese authorities have done an exhibition called People First, Life First, who was reported by the World Heritage, the World Health Officers who visited Wuhan last February. Other kinds of memorials are those in Bolivia, that in October 20,000, 165 white chairs were placed in the Plaza Bolivar in Bogota by doctors and nurses to remind the Colombian government and their colleagues died for lack of protective material. But also the empty chairs, in this case 20,000, that were placed by the US organization COVID Survivors for Change to pay tribute at Washington National Mall to the more than 209,000 residents of the US who have died from the virus by October 2020. The group of COVID Survivors for Change is comprised of families of victims and survivors who are calling for elected officials to do more to develop a national plan for safety and recovery. They declare Sunday, 5 October, a National Day of Remembrance for those who have died from corona, the 6-month mark of the pandemic, and the absence of any national recognition for those who killed by the virus. They say that the big part of the compounding of people's grief is actually the lack of acknowledgement and the lack of recognition. And from now on, I will pass to Eddie.
Okay, can everyone see the Google Earth that I have on my screen?
Yep. Yes.
Very, very good. Okay, so I'm going to move on to cemeteries. Cemeteries, by their nature, often act as memorials for individuals to cope with the loss of a loved one or friend during periods of cultural trauma, and their importance becomes magnified during the pandemics. Complications also arise specifically at these moments and makes the management of cemeteries difficult. The Wadi al-Salam cemetery in Najaf in Iraq has faced complex decisions since the arrival of COVID-19. Local cemeteries across the country initially began refusing to accept bodies of COVID-19 victims because people whose relatives had not died of the virus felt it was a stigma to be buried next to someone who had. The bodies were instead transferred to a new 600-hectare Corona cemetery near Najaf. In the autumn of 2020, in defiance of the recommendation of both public health officials and religious leaders, many families began exhuming the bodies to have them reburied in their local cemeteries. For some, this was a brief trip since the old Wadi al-Salam is nearby. Known as one of the world's oldest and quite likely largest cemeteries, it has been estimated that more than 7 million funerals have been conducted there over the past 250 years. In the midst of COVID-19, the typically large funerals are impractical, and the tradition of washing of the corpse initially was assumed to be dangerous. This led to many funerals at the new Corona cemetery being viewed as improper and requiring reburial. This naturally also created a great deal of anguish for the families of the deceased, which very much negates the kind of coping that should emerge from the memorialization process that occur at cemeteries. In April 2020, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio issued a decision that any victims of COVID-19 whose bodies remained unclaimed after 2 weeks would be transferred to Hart Island. I'll give you a quick view of the drone here. Just some drone footage there. And so this was part of a predetermined pandemic preparedness plan, but it is contentious because of the stigma associated with the graves on Hart Island. Known as a potter's field since around the time of the Civil War, Hart Island has become known as the final resting place of the destitute and the unknown. For most of its history, inmates from Rikers Island, which is a prison, were responsible for digging the graves and performing exhumations when families might come to claim a body and have it moved to another site. The connection with Rikers Island prevented the public from visiting graves at Hart Island, even to mourn without a great deal of regulation. Sorry. here. Just in 2000, another important connection with the present is that many of those who died during the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s in New York were also forced to be buried on Hart Island due to the early stigmatization of the disease. Just in 2019, New York City politicians such as Council Speaker Corey Johnson, who speaks openly about his experience being an HIV-positive gay man in the city, finally succeeded in creating legislation that would transfer the management of Hart Island from the Department of Corrections to the Department of Parks and Recreation. This has facilitated the opening of the island to the public for the purposes of mourning without the strict oversight of the past. When Mayor de Blasio required New York City to begin routing the bodies to the island, Melinda Hunt issued a Twitter post stating that Hart Island burials are not disrespectful now that inmate labor has ended. It's worth reflecting on this a little bit. Why is it that a burial by an inmate would inherently be disrespectful? As one inmate who worked on Hart Island explained, we did it with dignity and respect. We were the only ones there for these people. These were fellow New Yorkers, you know. Knowledge about the burial practices and the individuals interned in the graves has been painstakingly cataloged by Melinda Hunt at the Hart Island Project website. Through her website, Hunt has used the current pandemic not just to raise awareness for the way COVID-19 is affecting the poor and the vulnerable, but how the history of Hart Island highlights the way that all pandemics and diseases have an inequitable impact upon society. And now we'll move to cyber memorials, kind of relating to Melinda Hunt's project on Hart Island. As with other disasters and moments of trauma, the internet has offered a space that can connect people across vast distances. Existing platforms like Facebook and Twitter have been mobilized to memorialize family and friends who have died due to COVID-19. The Faces of COVID account on Twitter has, for instance, shared more than 5,000 tweets that include a picture and short obituary submitted by a family member or a friend. The account has 147,000 followers, and it is not uncommon that new posts will receive thousands of likes. The account was created by an American business owner, Alex Goldstein, and eventually intended to share posts mainly from the United States. There are numerous examples from beyond the US Twitter sphere, a good example being a post about Esther Akenyasa. And you can see here, this particular post actually also included a post from BuzzFeed, which was about Esther's final FaceTime with her son. Not wanting to worry her 27-year-old son, who took care of his 14-year-old sister, Esther had assured family that she would be fine, but passed away not long after. The post received 75 replies from people around the world sharing digital candles, emojis of broken hearts, or hands pressed together in prayer. Twitter allows for memorialization to take on a transnational practice of sharing and support among people who would otherwise be strangers. And while it is often assumed that the internet provides an open canvas for people to imagine creative ways to memorialize loss, cyber memorials of COVID-19 have primarily taken over one similar structure. Most are a list of names, a name list of those who have died because of the pandemic. This, of course, can be expressed in a variety of ways. For instance, on May 27th, the New York Times created the web-based memorial, An Incalculable Loss. So this includes shadowy figures for each of the first 100,000 individuals who died from COVID-19 in the United States. Next to actually, sorry. Okay. So there we go. Yeah. So next to each of some of the figures are the name and age, place of death, and description of a person drawn from the obituary. One caption reads, "Champion of social justice through architecture, Michael Sorkin." Michael was actually the archivist and architect who wrote critically of the redesign of Lower Manhattan following the attacks of 9/11 for his because he was critical because of the design's meagerness of vision and a vanishing over aestheticized sense of loss. And then if we go a little bit further down, a little while to find all these. But this reads from sports fan who loved Purdue University, Don Wahan, 67 from Indiana. And we know little else about Don, other than he worked in food services and enjoyed preparing Thanksgiving dinners, which we learned from his obituary. So an incalculable loss is thus primarily a mass obituary of loss within the United States that attempts to equalize each individual life through its imagery. But as the reader scrolls through the website, the New York Times included textual narrative to break up the long rows of shadowy figures and occasional mini obituaries, such as this block of text here. And now there certainly is a certain truth to what this is saying here. But it is odd to read such a text in a memorial that basically is just visually transforming the number 100,000. If it is possible to convey the individual arcs of life through a severed memorial, it is not quite that easy to see how that is accomplished through an incalculable loss. For the New York Times, the goal was primarily to make a visual statement interspersed with textual commentaries. Let me share another one. Yeah. In a larger sense, the suspension of our familiar rituals of burial or cremation reflected what life in a pandemic has been like, the absence of any clear end. Even the dead have to wait. This references the limitations placed on funeral services due to the pandemic, and we've talked about that a little bit with the cemeteries. So I think I'm going to skip down to our conclusion. And yeah. So what we have tried to do today is unpack the different layers of memorialization associated with COVID-19 and explain some of the cultural context that has generated these attempts to process the trauma that has affected so many across the globe. We have also discussed the diverse ways that individuals and communities process that trauma, regardless if it was through monuments, memorial events, cemeteries, cyber memorials, or changing. What we found across many cases around the world was a desire to express grief in a manner that would allow them to bear the loss created by the pandemic. Perhaps one thing that we have not been able to do is unpack how, even within each of our cases, there is variation, both in how the pandemic impacted individuals within these societies and in how individuals relate to these attempts to process the trauma through different kinds of memorials. The pandemic has not affected our lives equally, and more in-depth research in each of our cases would be necessary to uncover how diverse individuals within a given society react to and participate in the memorialization of COVID-19. We should also keep in mind that state actors in different contexts will have their own way of engaging, controlling, or coercing memorials to ensure that the process of trauma cannot undermine their control over social power. I'll close with an example from China again, where the world's first national COVID-19 memorial was held to commemorate the first responders who and the early victims of the COVID-19. Sorry. Well, yeah, there we go. Hopefully you can hear this. So that day, when the national ceremony was performed with the klaxon horns blaring in every city of the country, a microblogger with the internet name of Mali Lianmeng Liu posted a comment on the Weibo platform. It was a list of 46 grievances caused by the lockdown, such as the person who starved while being forced into quarantine at home, that person who used an orange peel as a face mask, that person who refused to wear a mask and has been beaten until they bled, the person who shouted down, "It's all fake," from a quarantined building to the national leaders who had arrived to conduct an inspection. Now, to anyone who can keep up with Chinese social media, this list of grievances caused by the trauma of lockdown across the country was well known. The post had received 157,000 likes despite Weibo platform administrators disabling the retweet and comments. The information shared in the post was nothing new. It had all been widely discussed across the country. But because the microblogger posted on the National Day of Mourning, she was arrested by police in her hometown of Scmhitt, which is about 1,200 kilometers away from Wuhan, on April 7th. Her case was not heard until December, when a local court sentenced her to further imprisonment of 6 months. So the processing of trauma through memorialization is complex and variable across the world. There are indeed different layers that allow this processing to take place. Each culture and political system has various means for putting those processes into motion or silencing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laia and Edwin. It has been really, really interesting. Do we have any questions? Well, I have a couple. First of all, what is your view about the legacy of these memorials? Oh, yeah, also Jim then. Yeah.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What's your view about the legacy of these memorials, perhaps specifically about the online ones?
Yeah, maybe I can talk to that a little bit. The one thing that we've been kind of looking at is comparing the way that online memorials for other traumatic moments have kind of persisted throughout time. One really long-term example from early internet days is the Vietnam Memorial, which started in 1994. And it has been very influential in bringing veterans of the Vietnam War into a kind of community where they can share a bit about both their experience in the war and the experience of coming back home and not entirely being welcomed by American society at that time, because there was rightful protest against the war at that time. So in some cases, I think it will be interesting to see how some of these online memorials will continue to exist as a way for people to kind of share their experiences, even across time and space. I think from my view, the Faces of COVID on Twitter probably will survive as long as Twitter does. But there's other examples that are a little bit more ambiguous. It's not really clear who is organizing or who's behind the management of some of these websites. And when that happens, I think it makes it a little bit more difficult to know if there is a long-term legacy for a memorial, a cyber memorial of that kind. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks very much. Laia, I was interested in what you were saying about the plague memorial in Vienna that had been kind of repurposed as a COVID memorial. And I think I was wondering if you've come across other examples, but it also strikes me as very interesting at the minute, particularly when there's a lot of debate about the politics of memorials and the idea that we can change the meaning of memorials in new contexts. I wonder if you could talk to that a bit.
Sorry. Oh, we can't hear you, Laia.
We show here the case of Vienna, but there is other ones in Czech. And also it will be interesting because, I mean, a lot of the columns that were built by the Empire was actually turned down. Okay. Because of the politics after the First World, or before the First World, about those times when the empire was crumbling. But it also has been rebuilt in Czechia, in Prague. So there is a lot of layers here. What is rebuilt, what is not rebuilt, and also how is it used now, and what layers of that monument is actually reused in today and reconfigured, because I don't think that those people who are leaving candles and messages in Vienna do have any relation with what the monument signified in the 18th century as part of the empire, and why it was then most of these columns during the Second War, after the Second War, when was the reconstruction of Central Europe after the war, they were again replaced as a part of this renationalizing of narratives of recovering nationalism and past glories. So it will be interesting to go further in these different layers, but again, is about talking to people and understanding what are their approach to the monument, and also if they are aware of all these layers of the history of the monument itself. Yeah. But I think we agree with Eddie that was a very interesting case. Because it goes into different, not only in terms of the disease and infections and the use of that, but also the politics of the monument next to health.
Maybe one other example that we could look at is also the connection with the AIDS Memorial Quilt in San Francisco. For a long time, that was actually kept within a warehouse in Atlanta. And just before the pandemic hit, there was a plan to bring it back to San Francisco where it had been made and had first been exhibited back in the 1980s and 1990s. And when the pandemic hit, I don't think it took too long before they realized, hey, we need to use this as an example to raise awareness about COVID as well. And then in June and July, they had a very large production and ceremony to unveil the AIDS Memorial Quilt, but everybody's wearing masks, and it was very much in solidarity with people suffering from COVID.
Yeah, and it raises the question about how much we need to understand how people respond to memorials, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Definitely.
Thank you.
But also not only the people, but also the authorities.
Yeah.
Which monuments are, if they are going to be reused, and how they are going to reuse, and how the new monuments are built, and in what phase and what purpose, and how they are going to be used. So this is different layers of as we say, of the monuments and their use.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Natalie in the chat. So the question is, do you think there is a stigma attached to COVID deaths globally, or does your research suggest that this is isolated to the specific countries mentioned in your presentation?
I can answer a little bit of that, if you like. Yes. Yeah, I think stigma is actually it's a very good question, and stigma is a very complex idea, because mainly I wouldn't consider stigma to be something that's binary, where it either is or isn't a stigma. It's more of a process, and a lot of that involves situational aspects of social power, and who is stigmatizing against who, and who's being stigmatized. And so I would say, though, that in many of the cases that we've seen, I think that stigma definitely impacted certain aspects of memorialization, certainly with cemeteries. But that also was because of a misunderstanding about whether or not dead bodies could actually transmit the disease after somebody had passed away. And we know now that that's probably not the case. But in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of confusion about that. And so it's been very difficult, especially at Wadi Al Salam and also in South Africa. It's been quite difficult to kind of get beyond that kind of a stigma that was created. And then, but I would say that I haven't seen, for instance, like on Faces of COVID, just from an example, I don't see a lot of notes or comments on that website that are attacking people for having COVID, or for having a family member that died from having COVID, which may be a little bit surprising, because Twitter and social media in general is not necessarily the most peaceful location. There can be a lot of conflict on social media as well. But at least I haven't seen that aspect yet, in at least on that particular site. So, but that's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is also the Natalie asked about the stigma with COVID deaths, but also we may think about the stigma with those who are contagious with and who has propagated. And then here we will need probably to layer what stigma means. If it's against one at the beginning, where there was this stigma about Chinese people, and but also there is a social stigma, who actually those who are in front working really, and they cannot be at home, but they are actually more easy to be infected by, because they are working in a very dangerous position, but they are stigmatized because they are probably migrants. And so there is a lot of issues with the stigma that probably needs to be layered at what we mean with stigma.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or any other comments for Laia and Edwin? I have one last question. What's next?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this was actually really useful, I think, because it's helped us centralize some ideas for a paper that we'd like to put together. So yeah, thanks for giving us this opportunity.
Well, thank you for giving this paper to us. It has been really fascinating and interesting. If it's okay with you, I'll share your email with the people who have attended the seminar. So in case people want to contact you, they can. And I would like to thank you again for today. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you both soon. Thank you. Thank you all for attending the seminar.
Thank you, Anna,
Thanks,
for
everyone.
organizing it and for inviting us.
And thank you. Okay. I'll send you the recording.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Stay
Bye.
safe. Bye-bye.